The distress beacon came without context, encrypted in a frequency older than most of the Galactic Alliance's protocols. 3 short bursts, a long pause, and one final sustained signal. Any species in the quadrant would have dismissed it as background noise. Ancient code lost to time. But the humans remembered. Somewhere between Mars moons and the ruins of a mining station, a single vessel answered. The DSS Mercy Wind, a Class V Omega medical cruiser built for deep space triage and recovery. Her hull was painted in gleaming white, punctuated by blazing red crosses. Universally recognized as neutral territory, even among the warring outer rings. She had no weapons. She didn't need any. The ship was designed for survival, not battle. And in the decades since Earth joined the interstellar community, her kind had earned respect not through power, but unrelenting service. Dr. Helena Voss, Chief Medical Officer aboard the Mercy Wind, stared at the transmission on the central monitor. Her fingers, long used to cutting into trauma patients, hovered above the control panel. The beacon's location placed it inside the contested zone of the Vokari front, where multiple factions clashed like insects in flame. Civilian vessels didn't last long there. Not even hospital ships dared it. Yet, she didn't hesitate. "Plot a course," she ordered. Behind her, the navigation AI confirmed with a subtle shift in engine tone. The rest of the crew stirred silently. No protests. No questioning her sanity. They were Deathworlders, humans, trained to walk into fire and drag others out. By the time they reached the coordinates, silence reigned. No wreckage. No bodies. Just emptiness, and the faint shimmer of a cloaking field. Something flickered into existence, an old escape pod, barely powered. When they brought it aboard, the airlock cycled with a hiss of stale oxygen, and what emerged was barely conscious. 4 limbs, 3 eyes, vestigial wings scorched to useless nubs. A Zavari, one of the oldest races in the sector. Extinct, according to most databases. They laid him on the surgical slab. His chest barely moved. Voss moved like thunder, issuing commands. Her team snapped into action. It wasn't about sides. A dying being was a dying being. The Hippocratic oath transcended species. When he awoke 3 days later, they expected gratitude. Instead, he screamed. Not words. Warnings. Please. In the Zavari tongue, long dead in practice, but loosely translated by the ship's linguistic AI, they followed me. Death comes. Burned the Red Cross. They didn't understand it then. They would. Too soon. At the outer perimeter of the sector, 12 warships entered slipspace. Hulls black as obsidian, marked with the insignia of the 12th Dominion, a militant faction infamous for attacking humanitarian convoys and disappearing before retaliation could find them. For years, they had avoided direct conflict with humans, choosing weaker prey. Not this time. Inside the Mercy Wind, the recovered Zavari's heart rate spiked. His physiology reacted violently to electromagnetic stimuli. The Dominion had seeded the area with localized EM pulses, low-grade interference that disrupted comms and medical instruments alike. It wasn't a random attack. It was surgical, calculated, designed to cripple a hospital ship without ever firing a shot. The crew noticed. One by one, vital systems blinked out. Stabilizers stuttered. Artificial gravity spasmed. Life support hiccuped for half a second, long enough for panic to ripple through the lower decks. Yet the humans didn't scream. They adapted. Voss switched to manual ventilation. Techs pulled out analog backups. The Dominion wanted them blind, paralyzed. Instead, they worked faster, more efficient. That was the thing about Deathworlders. They trained in chaos. In the communications bay, a young officer named Reyes pulled from a relic archive. Morse code, embedded in old military hardlines. One tap at a time, they reached out to any ship still listening, even if none would answer. The Dominion ships finally arrived in visible range. 12 against 1. They didn't hail. No warning, no demands. Just weapons charging. Bright lines of plasma dancing across their hulls like angry veins. Dr. Voss didn't blink. Seal off non-critical sections. Redirect auxiliary power to shield modulator. not to resist, but to flare. Make us glow. The tactic was insane. Any shield modulated at high frequency, while unarmed painted a ship as a target. But Voss had done her homework. Trelvith weapons operated on synchronized targeting systems. Overloading the visual spectrum disrupted automated locks. For 7 seconds, the Mercy Wind became a blinding white beacon. 7 seconds was all they needed. A hangar door cracked open, and 3 emergency shuttle drones launched. They were marked as humanitarian pods, non-combat, with automatic protocols to avoid engagement. They streaked past the Dominion ships like sparks from a flame. One was shot down immediately. The others evaded, diving into nearby debris. The Dominion didn't care. They had their prize. The first barrage struck. The hull groaned. Explosive decompression tore through the aft cargo bay, shredding thousands of pounds of medical equipment and cryo units. Dozens died instantly. But the humans didn't stop. They fought with fire blankets. They fought with sealant foam. One nurse used her body to plug a breach in the corridor wall until her teammates secured it. She died smiling. They remembered her name, Joanna. The Dominion boarded next. Precision strikes disabled the engines, and grappling claws latched onto the ship's spine. Boarding parties spilled through like ants, armored and armed. But they weren't prepared. What they found wasn't soldiers. It was medics, nurses, surgeons. But these humans didn't cower. They used surgical tools like daggers, defibrillators as stun weapons, cryo fluid hoses to freeze invaders mid-stride. The Dominion had expected compliance. They got guerrilla warfare. In the upper atrium, Dr. Voss stood at the heart of Triab, surrounded by the wounded, calmly operating as her ship turned into hell. When one Trelvith trooper burst through, she didn't flinch. She threw a bone saw. It struck him in the eye socket. He went down screaming. Outside, the Dominion flagship prepared its main cannon. It would rip the Mercy Wind in two. A war crime, but they'd done worse. As they charged the weapon, the Zavari patient, now stabilized, forced himself to his feet. He staggered into the bridge. His voice rasped in ancient tones. They fear truth. Let them learn. He touched the ship's emergency relay, a human-modified system he had no right to understand. But he did. He broadcast the Dominion's own codes, unlocked their communication logs, and sent them on all channels. Evidence. Proof. Dozens of raids. Civilian executions. Hidden war crimes. A data dump so massive it cracked encryption across Alliance relays. It hit the interstellar net like a virus. Suddenly, they weren't anonymous predators. They were criminals. The Galactic Alliance rerouted patrols. Neutral factions turned hostile. Even rival empires began converging, not to help the humans, but to claim evidence. Before they could retreat, something tore space apart. A hole. A rift. A new arrival. The DSS Redemption, sister ship to the Mercy Wind. Armed, unlike her kin. The humans had broken their silence. The Redemption didn't fire. She broadcast. Her captain, a quiet man named Ogden, spoke only once. You opened fire on the Red Cross. You broke the code. Now you answer. The Deathworlder ship hadn't responded to any of the Empire's warnings, hails, or ultimatums. Its silence was defiant. But the real insult was its presence in the aftermath, unscarred, hovering peacefully among the wreckage of an entire Imperial fleet. Debris drifted like confetti around its armored hull, painted white with red medical crosses, as if mocking the Empire's concept of war. Commandant Ural watched the footage again and again. The hospital ship hadn't fired a single weapon, hadn't even raised shields. It had simply moved through the battlefield with cold, terrifying calm. Imperial cruisers, dreadnoughts, carriers, all of them gone. Crushed. But the hospital ship floated untouched, almost serene. He found no pride in the massacre. Only dread. The Council demanded answers, but Ural was out of them. They wanted to know how a humanitarian vessel had slipped past orbital interdiction, destroyed several squadrons of elite fighters, and extracted over 600 prisoners of war without taking a single casualty. They wanted to know why some of their most decorated field officers were found crying and curled in corners, mumbling about the ones in white. The answer was simple. The Empire had made a mistake. It had treated the humans like it treated all the other Deathworlders, violent, primitive, reckless. But humans were something else. They brought mercy with the same hand they brought annihilation, and they saw no contradiction in that duality. Captain Rhys Maddox, the acting commander of the hospital ship Diana, stood in the operations center going over the casualty report from the enemy fleet. The destruction hadn't been the Diana's doing. Not directly. It was the human escort craft, repurposed atmospheric fighters retrofitted for space. Fast, unpredictable, and piloted by medics. Not soldiers. The Empire couldn't wrap its head around that detail. Medics didn't do surgical bombing runs. Medics didn't use boarding claws to crash into battleships and pull survivors out under enemy fire. But Rhys knew better. Every crew member aboard the Diana had been trained in tactical triage, but also asymmetrical warfare. They were healers, yes, but healers who had survived on a death world. Their compassion didn't come from softness. It came from surviving a planet that tried to kill them every day. Lieutenant Sora Tanaka, head of extraction teams, briefed him. She was covered in blood, some of it hers, most of it not, and still hadn't slept. Her voice was calm as she went over the mission results. They'd retrieved 113 human POWs and 38 enemy soldiers who'd surrendered. They would be treated the same, in accordance with human code. No difference between friend and foe once they entered the ship. But the recovered enemy soldiers were terrified. Not of pain, of kindness. They weren't prepared for it. The ones who weren't sedated were restrained for their own safety. A few had tried to claw their eyes out, mumbling about being unworthy. Others begged to be executed, certain the humans were performing some kind of psychological torture. Rhys wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. The Empire's troops were bred to believe in strength through dominance. In their minds, if someone spared you, they were showing superiority. Pity was humiliation. But human mercy didn't stem from hierarchy. It came from principle. And that made it more terrifying. The Diana's recovery bay was full. The AI had to convert cargo storage into overflow triage zones. Dozens of nurses, augmented with cybernetic hands for rapid microsurgery, moved like ghosts among rows of wounded. Enemy soldiers groaned and wept as their shattered limbs were repaired. One alien captain, his thorax nearly split in two, whispered in disbelief when a human medic whispered to him, "You're safe now." He'd never heard that phrase used by an enemy. Aboard the remains of the Imperial fleet, few survivors were left. But one had seen it all. Tactical Admiral Vector, who'd barely escaped death when his ship's bridge had been cored open like fruit. He was now confined to an Imperial recovery ward, but his testimony reached the Council in time to be documented. They did not fight like warriors, he said, shaking. They fought like surgeons. They cut only what they meant to. No more. And then they healed those they broke. When asked to elaborate, Vector described a human strike team that boarded his ship, not with explosives, but plasma scalpels. They breached compartments with precision, extracted wounded personnel, and left supplies behind for any survivors. They didn't gloat. They didn't linger. They moved like wind. The Council dismissed the report as psychological trauma. But whispers spread. In the outer colonies, border systems began refusing orders to engage any ship bearing the Red Cross. Superstitions took root. Rumors of ghost fleets, of ships that appeared without weapons and left behind nothing but silence. The humans weren't waging war. They were changing what war meant. Back aboard the Diana, Rhys received a distress call from an independent colony station in contested space. A plague had broken out. Human DNA markers indicated weaponized genome targeting. Clearly an experimental Empire bioweapon. His team didn't hesitate. They changed course immediately, though they knew the area was crawling with Empire scouts. As they entered the system, they found it worse than expected. The Empire had arrived first and blockaded the station. They were letting the plague run its course to cleanse the population. A show of strength, they called it. Reese called it genocide. The Diana didn't have firepower, but it had something better. Velocity. The medical ship dropped from FTL at a slingshot angle around the system's gas giant, using gravitational momentum to launch itself straight through the blockade. Empire cruisers opened fire. None of the shots landed, not because of evasive maneuvers, but because of timing. The Diana's hull shimmered. It wasn't cloaked. It was transparent, bending light and EM radiation. The ship had gone nearly invisible. A project born from a forgotten human black-budget program. Reese activated the emergency transmission, a warning ping to all nearby vessels. Hospital ship in theater. Any act of aggression will result in targeted civilian defense operations. 15 auxiliary drones launched from the Diana, cloaked and silent. They didn't attack. Instead, they infected the enemy ship's data streams with a nanovirus designed not to cripple, but to confuse. It scrambled targeting data, made the Diana's heat signature appear as background radiation, and falsified internal alerts. Half the Empire fleet thought the others were mutineers. In the chaos, the Diana slipped past. They docked with the station as the plague ravaged its lower decks. The station's civilian doctors had died days ago. The only ones left were panicked maintenance techs trying to sterilize corridors with makeshift flamethrowers. Reese's team moved in without fear. They'd trained for worst-case scenarios. They'd operated in flesh-melting viral zones on Earth. A floating death trap wasn't new to them. They carried the infected out on stretchers. Each one was sedated and sealed in isolation pods. The crew brought portable sterilization towers, mobile surgery platforms, and even emotional support bots to calm the dying. Empire drones tried to breach the station to finish the job, but they were repelled, not by weapons, but by counter-hacked airlocks. Reese had anticipated them. Whispers of another incident reached them through encrypted channels. A mining colony in the Velatari system, blockaded by a renegade Imperial admiral who refused the ceasefire. He'd weaponized starvation, letting children die to draw out the white demon. He wanted the Diana to come, thinking he could trap her. Use the starving as bait. Reese went anyway. They didn't enter orbit. They dropped straight into atmosphere on manual override. Hull plating glowed red-hot as they smashed through defensive satellites. They absorbed direct hits without returning fire. The Diana wasn't there to fight. She was there to evacuate. Atmospheric maneuvering retrofitted for surgical landings allowed them to hover meters above rooftops. Ropes and harnesses dropped. Drones began pulling people up. Medical platforms formed triage zones mid-air. The Admiral tried to jam transmissions, so the Diana flooded the spectrum with heartbeat data from every patient on board. Hundreds of thousands of signals. It overwhelmed every frequency. A wall of life. The Empire's own communication system collapsed under the pressure. Their targeting arrays fried trying to process the signals. The Diana evacuated over 8,000 people in 6 hours. When the Admiral finally caught up, he found the city empty. But the medical drones had left something behind. Power cells, food caches, inoculation kits. And a single message burned into the sand outside the command tent. We came to save, not punish. Do not make us return. For Reese, it wasn't victory. It was maintenance. The job wasn't done. It would never be done. Every system they touched spawned 2 more in need. The galaxy wasn't short of war. It was short of people willing to run into it unarmed, dragging stretchers behind them. Sara Tanaka lost a leg in the evacuation. A shrapnel mine embedded near the final evac zone. Reese found her still trying to triage a wounded child, crawling through blood with a tourniquet in her teeth. When they pulled her back to the Diana, she laughed while they amputated. At least it wasn't the good leg, she said, already adjusting her prosthetic specs. 3 days later, she was back on the floor, walking rounds, operating one-handed while calibrating her new limb with the other. Nobody questioned it. That was the norm aboard the Diana. No one had time to grieve properly. Not because they didn't care, but because someone else was always bleeding somewhere. The Empire tried propaganda. They called the Diana a rogue element, claimed it harvested organs, accused it of brainwashing prisoners. It backfired. For every lie, there were thousands of first-hand accounts. Aliens who'd been saved told their stories with reverence. Not because the humans were kind, but because they were unstoppable in their kindness. One transmission went viral. A child from the outer belt, tearful and half-mast from recovery, simply said, "I thought monsters wore red eyes, but the humans wore white, and they saved my sister." The statement hit harder than any plasma barrage. Reese heard it late one shift, sitting alone in the ship's old observation deck. The stars looked the same, but everything else had changed. He didn't feel like a legend, just a man who hadn't found a way to stop. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept more than 2 hours. Couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal. He'd eaten rations next to open wounds, taken caffeine injections while holding arteries shut. His body was barely holding up, but the mission held firm. A new distress call pinged. A prison transport ship had been sabotaged, falling out of orbit above a gas giant. Both guards and prisoners were dying. Reese accepted the coordinates. He didn't ask which side they were on. Didn't care. The Red Cross didn't distinguish. The rescue effort was brutal. High-atmosphere insertions required pressurized surgical domes that buckled under turbulent forces. But the crew adapted. They used surgical foam to create hard-stabilized fields mid-air, catching the falling survivors like nets. Of the 300 lives aboard, they saved 279. The rest had already suffocated. Reese made sure their names were recorded anyway. Even death wouldn't deny them acknowledgement. The Empire tried once more, not with ships or weapons, but with words. An envoy, a former diplomat, a captured human turned mouthpiece. He was allowed aboard, offered no restraints, and given access to a neutral space to speak. He asked Reese to stand down. He told him the galaxy couldn't handle the Diana, that her existence destabilized decades of balance, that the Red Cross had become a flag of rebellion, and soon the Empire would have no choice but to strike harder, with no restraint. He told Reese that his kindness was cruelty in disguise, that saving people today meant more would die tomorrow. Reese didn't respond immediately. He let the man talk, let the poison spill. Then he showed him the list, the one carved into the Diana's central hall. Names, rows upon rows of them. Not just the saved, not just the dead, but the forgotten. People who would never be memorialized anywhere else. Whole villages, whole species, whole worlds. Their only proof of existence was etched into the walls of a ship that refused to let them vanish. Reese simply said, "Tell me who I should have let die." The envoy had no answer. He left in silence. But the council heard what they needed. A final order went out. The Diana was to be destroyed. Every fleet, every asset, every sleeper agent was activated. No more warnings. No more offers. Elimination. Reese knew. Of course he did. They'd intercepted fragments of chatter. Dozens of ships converging on their current system. A trap too wide to dodge. Too coordinated to run. He didn't run. He transmitted a final signal. To every ship, every system, every being they had saved. He asked nothing. He only said, "We will hold the line. If we fall, remember not how we died, but who we died for." The Diana remained in orbit above an agricultural moon, still tending to a fungal outbreak in the crops. The children there played around the landing struts, unaware of the coming storm. The crew reinforced medical zones, converted every corridor into trauma-ready sectors. Reese didn't authorize weapons. He didn't need to. The first wave of attackers came fast. Drones, carriers, swarms. But something happened. They didn't get through. Not because of human weapons, but because 100 ships appeared to block them. Freighters, converted miners, obsolete cargo runners. All of them civilian. All of them piloted by those the Diana had saved. None armed, but all in the way. The attackers had to go around. By the time they reached the Diana, the signal had spread. Refugees across the sector powered their transmitters and jammed the Empire's targeting systems. Stations beamed chaos onto encrypted channels. Even old AI satellites from derelict colonies reactivated, forming a barrier of noise. The Diana was protected by life itself. The Empire never breached orbit. The Council pretended it was a strategic withdrawal. But everyone knew. The legend had grown too large. Reese stood in the triage bay, hands covered in antiseptic gel, helping a new medic intubate a patient with collapsed lungs. Outside the window, enemy ships retreated, their weapons untouched. No celebrations. No victory speeches. Just more work to do. The war would continue. But so would the Diana. Because some ships were never built for war. They were built for what comes after. And no empire could stop that.